Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thank you. Thank you very much for joining. I hope you can hear me well, and you have us on your screens, the chair, co-chair presenters. This session was supposed to be chaired by a colleague, Liliana Carvajal, but she is on her way to Bristol because of a canceled flight arriving late. So I will try to chair, and we have about 1.5 hours for this session. And yeah, welcome to the International Conference on Families using the multiple indicator cluster surveys. As I mentioned, my name is Turgay Unalan, Statistics and Monitoring Specialist in Data Collection Unit of Data and Analytics section of UNICEF, and we'll be chairing today's session on education and learning, the first of the sessions about this topic. My co-chair today is Ivana Bjelic. She is also a statistics and monitoring specialist in our data collection unit in data and analytics section of UNICEF. Before I start introducing our speakers and give the floor to them one by one, a few words of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be hosted on the UNICEF Mix website and YouTube channel, as well as on the Bristol Poverty Institute YouTube channel and embedded on the Bristol Poverty Institute website after the event. By attending, you consent to be part of this recording. Please ensure that you have added your name rather than being listed as guest, as we will be monitoring attendees and need to know who is asking our speakers questions. You will be able to ask questions via MS Teams Q&A function on the top of your screen. So if you have questions, please go there and write down your questions. At the end of all 4 presentations, we will try to compile these questions and direct to the presenters one by one, and hoping that the time will be enough to answer all of these. We will try to respond to all of your questions. But due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer every question. Apologies in advance if that happens. Please also note that the chat function is not available to attendees, and you should be using the Q&A function if you have any questions to the presenters. Please be respectful. All events at this conference are being monitored, and we reserve the right to remove attendees whose comments are deemed offensive or derogatory. We have 4 presentations for this session, and given that we have about 1.5 hours allocated for this session, each presenter will have a maximum of 15 minutes to present, and after the end of the 4 presentations, we will visit the questions asked and give the presenters a chance to respond towards the end. Presenters will be sharing their screens and run their own presentations, but for presenters, let us know if you have difficulty so that we can share your presentations from our end. Other speakers of the session, please keep your microphones muted until it is your time to present. The first presentation in this session is titled Child Fostering and School Attendance in West Africa, and it will be presented by Pearl Kyei from the University of Ghana in Ghana. Pearl, the floor is yours. Please share your screen, and you may start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. At least I can.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So today I'll be speaking on child fostering and school attendance in West Africa, which is part of broader work that I'm currently doing on the welfare of foster children in the Sub-Saharan African region. This is the outline of my presentation. Okay, so child fostering, informal child fostering arrangements, particularly kinship care, is really part of what is called the social parenting culture in Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a practice that is quite prevalent the most recent estimates is that 20 to 40% of mothers in West African countries have fostered out at least one child. So really something that affects a substantial number of children in the sub-region. There are two main types of child fostering. So there's crisis, which is prompted by its name, a crisis. So typically the loss of a parent forces, the child to be fostered out to other people who can care for the child. And there is purposive fostering, which is my interest in this paper. So purposive fostering is when the parents voluntarily send out the child to another household to live with them for an extended period of time. And this is really done for a variety of reasons: to promote, social mobility, to strengthen kinship ties, sometimes to facilitate, maternal migration. So mothers need to move somewhere for economic opportunities. They can foster the child to people who can take care of the child while the mother is away. And one of the main reasons is really to provide educational opportunities. So in this region, we know that two of the leading barriers to education are household economic constraints and then lack of geographic proximity to schools. So once a child is fostered, this can be alleviated either by placing them in the household with fewer constraints or in households that are closer to schools. So on paper, fostering is supposed to benefit children. But theoretically, the suggestion is that the child fostering would be detrimental for educational outcomes. The human capital theory predicts that when children who are not the biological children of the household head, or people who are not original members of the household head, original members of the household, when resources are being allocated, they are likely to face discrimination. So in this case, the children who are fostered would be less likely to go to school than children who are original members of the household. The second is the Cinderella effect, which is really from the literature that looks at the influence of, having a step parent on child outcomes. So children are more likely to be maltreated by their step parents. And this is the context where there is even a biological parent present. So when you extend that to foster children where there's no biological parent present in the household, then you can expect that their fostering can be detrimental to the outcomes. But the empirical literature is actually mixed. So some studies have found that there's no difference in the likelihood of attending school between children who are fostered and those who are not fostered. Some studies have found a negative correlation. Some people have found a positive correlation. And there's a lot of explanation for some of those differences. Sometimes it could be based on the closeness of the relationship. So when children are placed with family members, they are more likely to benefit. When the arrangements are more informal, it can be more likely to be detrimental. And then when they are fostered to wealthier households, the effect is more likely positive. So there's really quite a bit to explain why the findings are mixed. So in this study, I want to focus on looking at the relationship between purposive fostering and school attendance. And I hypothesized that fostered children would be less likely to attend school based on what the theoretical literature would suggest. And the second is that the difference would be expected to have narrowed over time because there are free primary education policies being rolled out across the sub-region, and those are meant to reduce the financial barriers to education. So if children are even fostered in households and their economic constraints, they will still be more likely to go to school because of the fact that school is not as expensive as it used to be. The second is that looking at the gap between fostered and non-fostered children and trying to understand whether the gap differs depending on the household wealth quintile of the household they are living in, with the hypothesis that children who are fostered but are living in wealthier households, the difference would be smaller compared to those who are not fostered. And this is when you compare it to children who are in the poorer household wealth quintiles, because we expect that wealthier households have more resources. So they should be able to both educate the fostered and non-fostered children in their households. To answer these research questions, I used data from mix 3 and 6 because of the interest in the time period. So I picked surveys that had been conducted at least a decade apart, and there were 5 countries. So in mix 3, the surveys were conducted in 2005 and 6, and then the mix 6, 2017, 2018. I restricted the sample to children 6 to 12 years. This is the equivalent of primary school age. And then the atypical nature of this sample that's different from other studies is that both biological parents of the child has to be alive. As I mentioned earlier, the crisis fostering is something that is really has a direct influence on educational outcomes. So typically in a sample of foster children, you find children who are orphaned and children who are not orphaned. But we know that orphanhood in and of itself has a direct influence on educational outcomes. And because the survey does not provide information on why the child was fostered, I restrict it to children with both parents alive to limit the sample to children, I presume with this exclusion, are purposively fostered. I ran a multi-level logit regression analysis. So the pooled sample for mix 3 and mix 6, the regression is run separately for the two samples to compare the correlation between school attendance and fostering. So school attendance is measured as, has the child ever attended school? Foster child is measured as a child who is not residing with their parents. Remember that every child in this sample has both biological parents alive. I ran two models. The first one is just the base model, so predicting the influence of fostering on school attendance and controlling for all the covariates. And the second model includes an interaction term for the foster status and the household wealth quintile. And this is to see whether the difference between fostered and non-fostered children changes by the household wealth quintile. On to the results. So almost a fifth of the children in the sample were fostered in both mix 3 and mix 6, slightly higher in mix 6. In terms of school attendance, the numbers are quite similar. Again, slightly higher for the fostered children in mix 3, slightly higher for children who are not fostered in mix 6. I present the coefficients of some of the key variables in the model. So what we find is that in the mix 3 regression, which is presented on the left, fostering, the coefficient is negative, but it is not statistically significant. In contrast to mix 6, so we find that children who are fostered have about, a less likelihood of ever attending school. And this difference is statistically significant. So we see a difference in the two time periods in this relationship. Also noting that the influence of household wealth quintile on education is quite similar across the two time periods. So we see that increasing household wealth quintile is correlated with higher odds of attending school. And we keep this in mind as we look at the results of the interaction. So this is presenting the coefficients on the interaction term. So what we find is that for the foster children in the poorest wealth quintiles, which is the first bar, the fostering actually has a positive but not significant coefficient. So really it implies that for the poorest households, we don't see that the fostering is detrimental. But when you disaggregate by the other household wealth quintiles, we find that the difference between fostered and non-fostered children progressively grows larger by the wealth quintile. And we see this in mix 3. In the mix 6, we also see that it increases, but it's inverted for the last two. So the largest gap is observed in the fourth quintile as opposed to the richest quintile. These are the predicted probabilities of ever attending school. And this is just to illustrate what was shown by the coefficients on the interaction. So we see that for the poorest households, the children who are fostered actually have a higher likelihood of being in school. But this pattern is reversed. So when you look at the middle fourth richest in the mix 3, and you look at the second, middle, fourth, and richest in the mix 6, you find that the children who are fostered have a lower likelihood of attending school. So in conclusion, looking at the research questions that I asked earlier, so have there been changes over time in the relationship? So we see from the two regression models that in mix 3, the difference was not statistically significant. So fostering was, we could say, neutral. In Mix 6, the more recent time period, being fostered was correlated with significantly lower odds of ever attending school. So the relationship has changed over time, but not in the direction that was hypothesized. The second one is whether the household wealth quintile influences the relationship between foster status and school attendance. So the hypothesis was that because the wealthier households have more resources, we actually would find little differences between fostered and non-fostered children. But that is actually not what the analysis showed. It's actually in the poorest households where we find that there's really no difference. But for the wealthier households, the size of the foster disadvantage, that is the gap between children who are fostered and children who are not fostered, widens as the wealth quintile increases. And I mean, there could be some alternative explanation. So even though the households that are wealthier have more resources, there is some evidence that in wealthier households in this context, they do have, demand for domestic labor. So when they foster in children, their primary motivation may be to get domestic labor. And this is something that is going to conflict with the child's school attendance. So that is one of the reasons why the wealthier households actually show a greater disadvantage for the foster children. The other thing is that it's possible that there can be some power dynamics at play. So you can imagine that if poorer parents foster their children to wealthier households, they really may not have the power, or they might be empowered enough to ensure that their children do get to attend school. Or it could be that their rationale for fostering children out is not for them to attend school, but it could be for them to work as domestic labor and earn some income. So this really highlights the need for additional research, on the dynamics of fostering children, really to higher socioeconomic status households. So to understand why are parents, fostering out their children to these higher SES households, what are their expectations? Because you can see from the two time periods that the prevalence of fostering has actually experienced a slight uptick. So the practice is still persistent, and presumably parents do see benefits to fostering out their children. So a bit more research on these dynamics are required. And then when we think about the policy side, really thinking about either instituting or strengthening mechanisms in these, countries that can help to monitor the welfare of fostered children, particularly those in higher SES households, because we can see that, more than 10% of the children, even in the more recent period, were not attending school. And given that education is, a human right, it's impossible to ensure that all children, regardless of whether they reside with their biological parents or not, should attend school. So I'll end here. Thank you for your attention. And then I'm sharing the citation for the paper, which was recently just published. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Pearl. Yeah, you're right on time. Thank you very much for that, especially. And colleagues, attendees, if you have any questions that you may want to ask, please go to Q&A and write down your questions. And at the end of the four presenters' presentations, we will give chance to Pearl and others to respond to your questions. But you also have the email at the end of the presentation you have seen. So you may also write to Pearl and follow up with that presentation. Thank you very much, Pearl. So the next presentation is titled, Are Private Schools Equipping Children with More Foundational Literacy and Numeracy Skills Than Public Schools in South Asia? And it will be presented by Rakibul Hassan from Kobe University in Japan. Hassan, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
It's coming up. Yes, now we can see. If you can make it full screen. Yeah, all good.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Mix and UNICEF, for giving me the opportunity to present my research titling, Are Private Schools Equipping Children with More Foundational Literacy and Numeracy Skills Than Public Schools in South Asia? Evidences from Mix 6. So my name is Rakibul Hassan, and I am a graduate school of International Cooperation Studies student at Kobe University, Kobe, Japan. So this is the outline of my presentation. So without further ado, I am going to the introduction part. So in the background, we can say like SDG target 4.1.1 say that we will target the proportion of children and young people in grades 2 or 3, or at the end of primary, or at the end of lower secondary, achieving at least minimum proficiency level in reading and mathematics by sex that we call foundational literacy and numeracy skill. So if children have foundational literacy and numeracy skills, they can understand other subjects because these are the base of the other subjects. So without understanding this, without having this, they cannot understand other subjects. So when they understand other subjects, they develop advanced skills for fourth industrial revolution and also becomes employable and computable human capital for the fourth industrial revolution. So with the introduction of SDGs, as many of the developing countries have achieved universal access to primary education and high completion rate, the year of schooling alone is not a convincing proxy for quality of education that was used to use before SDGs. So due to the limitation of public schools to accommodate and equip students with quality education, private schools have mushroomed in South Asia. And in addition, in South Asia, parental demand for private schooling and increasingly tutoring is based on the perception that better quality education and interest in seeking competitive advantage from private schools. Moreover, international organizations like the World Bank and UNICEF use foundational literacy and numeracy skills as the indicators of quality education nowadays. However, despite such importance on foundational literacy and numeracy skills and giving the ongoing debates on the effectiveness of private schools over public schools, there is a lack of research that examines whether public schools or private schools are more effective in equipping children with foundational learning skills. So this is my problem statement. So the debate of public versus private school is not a new phenomenon. So after the Coleman put forward their results from the United States, showing that private schools actually are better in equipping students with cognitive skills than their public counterparts. And following that studies, so there are multiple studies in developing countries, and many studies were conducted in South Asian countries as well. And most of them confirm that students who attend private schools perform better than their public school counterparts. However, the critics claim that public school service cannot be sustainably provided by profitable private institutions that can be said like private schools. In addition, one study found that private school benefit becomes largely and statistically insignificant after conducting multivariate analysis on data balanced using propensity score matching technique. And in addition to existing debate regarding the effectiveness of private school over the public schools in developing countries, none of the studies actually in South Asian context consider the foundational literacy and numeracy skills as their dependent variables. And since the research on this topic used different indicators for academic outcomes of students in different countries in South Asia, it is really difficult to compare performance of the private and public schools in different South Asian countries. And furthermore, to date, there is no research examining whether public school or private school are more effective in equipping students with foundational literacy and numeracy skills using the same indicator, that is the foundational literacy and numeracy skills in South Asian countries. Again, one of the study argues that private schools are more effective since wealthier and high-performing students are attending private schools. However, in South Asia, one of the studies argue that even poor students can access low-fee primary public schools, unlike the urban areas. Therefore, it is not intuitive how household factors stratify the effect of public and private schools in South Asia. So based on the research gap, I have this research question. So I have two research questions. Research question one is, which type of school has higher probability of equipping children with foundational literacy and numeracy skills in South Asia? And the second one is, how does household factors, that is household wealth and education of the household head, stratify the effect of the type of school on students' foundational numeracy skills in South Asia? And the objective of the study is also echoing the research question. So to underpin the existing gap in the literature, this study has the following objective. The study examines which type of school has higher probability of equipping children with foundational literacy and numeracy skills in South Asia. And the study also assessed the stratified effect of type of schools on children's foundational literacy and numeracy skills by household factor, that is household wealth and education of the household health. So this is the significance of my study. Unlike previous studies, this study uses foundational literacy and numeracy skills as the dependent variables in examining the whether private and public schools are more effective in equipping foundational literacy skills and numeracy skills in South Asia. And also we use the same dependent variable and same independent variables for all countries. So that makes us to compare the effectiveness of private and public schools in equipping students all across South Asia. And the stratified effect of the school type of children's foundational literacy numeracy skills by household wealth and education of the household health shows the household factors play a significant role in effectiveness of school. With the presence of some household factors, public schools can be more effective than private school in some circumstances. So this finding add a new insight in the debate of public versus private schools. So these are some literature that I have reviewed, but I'm skipping those because of the lack of times. So this is the analytical framework I used. And these are my hypotheses based on the analytical framework. So based on the previous literature, this study posits the following hypothesis. Hypothesis one is children who attend private school are more likely to have foundational literacy skills compared to the children who attend public schools. And hypothesis two is children who attend private school are more likely to have foundational numeracy compared to children who attend public schools. And hypothesis three is the effect of type of school on students' foundational literacy skills are stratified by household factor, that is household wealth index and education of the household health. And the effect is also stratified in the case of foundational numeracy skills as well. So this is the econometric model I'm going to use. So based on the previous research, I'm also applying binary logistic regression model because my dependent variable is binary in nature. So I have model 1 for foundational literacy skills and model 2 is for foundational numeracy skills. So this study is using multiple indicator cluster survey, that is mixed round 6 data for Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. And for Pakistan, this study uses appended and merged data sets for Balochistan, Khyber, Punjab, and Sindh. And this study uses merged data from section where detailed information on current school-going children from age 5 to 17 years old, and also their basic learning and demonstrating skills that we can find in FS dataset, and also from the section of household information that we can find in HL dataset. And after cleaning and restricting samples for primary school children, because we are only focusing on primary school children, this study uses the data of 4,781 children in Afghanistan, 12,644 children in Bangladesh, 3,847 children in Nepal, and 18,075 children in Pakistan. So this is the definition of the variables. So I have dependent variables as foundational literacy skills and numeracy skills. So if the children can have they can recognize 90% of the word in a story, they have word recognition and they can interpret information and they can have inferential skills, then they will be noted as having reading skills. And if they can answer all of them, like the following 4, they can read the numbers, they can discriminate the numbers, they can do the number addition, and they recognize the number pattern, then they have numeracy skills. And we have dependent variables, that is type of schools, household characteristics. So we have household head's education, either he has no education or post-primary education. And also area, I have household characteristics, that is wealth index from poorest to the richest, and also number of children in the household. And for children's characteristics, I have sex and either the beginning of school year and functional difficulties, whether he or she has functional difficulties or not. So this is the summary statistics. Skipping this one. So this is the descriptive statistics. So in the Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and Pakistan, you can see in all 4 countries, private schools have more of the students who have actually reading skills. And also, if you look at the household wealth, so the richest children from the richest household are showing more literacy skills in all of the countries, and while showing it's lower for Afghanistan and it's the highest for Nepal. Same can be seen for numeracy skills in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan as well. So this is the result from my hypothesis one. As you can see, compared to the base group that is public, in Afghanistan, they have more than 48% of high likelihood to have literacy skills, and in Bangladesh, they have 16% of high likelihood of having literacy skills, and in Nepal, they have 31.9% of more likelihood to have literacy skills, and for Pakistan, they have 43.4% of having likelihood of having literacy skills. So if we go to the results for hypothesis one, so the estimation shows that attending private school increased children's odds of having foundational literacy by 48.8% in Afghanistan, 16% in Bangladesh, 31.9% in Nepal, and 43.4% in Pakistan compared to the public schools. So therefore, our hypothesis one is accepted. And in public school, however, perform better in Afghanistan compared Bangladesh, Nepal compared to the religious schools, while in Pakistan, the religious schools perform better than the public schools. However, the odds ratio is insignificant. And compared to the poorest household, richer household increases the children's odds of having foundational literacy skills in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, all the countries. And when the household has post-primary education, the children's odds of having foundational literacy skills increases by 38.1% in Afghanistan, 39.5% in Bangladesh, 40.3% in Nepal, and 56.9% in Afghanistan. And this is the results for hypothesis 2. So the estimation shows that attending private school increased children's odds of having foundational numeracy by 60.6% in Afghanistan, 14 point in Bangladesh, and 124.6% in Nepal, and 70.8% in Pakistan compared to public schools. Therefore, our hypothesis 2 is accepted as well. And compared to the poorest household, belonging to a richer household increases children's odds of having foundational numeracy skills in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. However, in Pakistan, belonging to household in the middle and fourth wealth quintile decreases children's odds of having foundational numeracy skills. And when that household head has post-primary education, it's like he has the more likelihood to have foundational numeracy skills in all 4 countries. So this is the stratified effects of foundational literacy numeracy skills and by household wealth and the education of the household health. So if you see this, the stratified effect of school type on foundational literacy and numeracy skills by household factors in rural Afghanistan shows that private schools are still effective even when the household head doesn't have any education. So this pattern is similar for all household wealth quintile group. And also, both private and public schools are more effective in equipping children with foundational literacy and numeracy skills when the household head has post-primary education. So you can see in this stratified graphs. And household wealth stratifies the effect of both public and private schools. The richer the household is, the more likelihood that the children will have benefits from both public and private schools. And for Bangladesh, the same pattern can be seen. However, the stratified effect of the school type on foundational literacy and numeracy skills by household factors in rural Bangladesh shows that private schools are more effective than public schools only when the household head has post-primary education. Other than that, the public schools are actually better than private schools in Bangladesh. However, both public and private schools are more effective in equipping children with foundational literacy and numeracy skills when the household head actually has post-primary education. And when the household wealth stratified the effect of both public and private schools, when the household is actually richer, it is more likely that the children will have more foundational literacy and numeracy skills compared to the household that is actually poor or poorest. So this pattern indicates that effectiveness of private schools largely depends on the household factors other than the school factors. So this is for Nepal.
Can you wrap up in 2 minutes, Rakibul?
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So for Nepal, the stratified effect of school type on foundational literacy skills by household factors in rural Nepal shows that private schools are more effective, like other two countries, than public, only when the household head has post-primary education. However, for foundational numeracy skills, private schools are still more effective when the household head doesn't have any education. This graph is actually showing this. And however, both private schools and public schools are more effective in equipping children with foundational literacy and numeracy skills when the household head actually has post-primary education. And for Pakistan, it has like a different pattern. So the stratified effect of the type of foundational literacy skills by household factors in rural Pakistan shows that private schools are more effective than public schools only when the household head has post-primary education. Other than that, the public schools are better than the private schools. However, for foundational numeracy skills, the private schools are still more effective even when the household head doesn't have any education. So however, both private schools and public schools are more effective in equipping children when the household head has post-primary education. And it's also true that for the richer households, the children has more high likelihood to have both foundational literacy and numeracy skills in Pakistan as well. So we can conclude that the analysis shows that private schools are more effective in equipping children with foundational literacy and numeracy skills compared to public schools in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. And according to some authors, the deterioration of government school standard can be attributed to the lack of teacher accountability, strong unions, poor facilities, high pupil-teacher ratios, and poor management. And also, since private schools attract high-performing and wealthy students in public schools don't get the benefits of high-performing peers. In addition, lack of incentive of public school to improve quality of education also influences public schools' less effectiveness compared to the private schools. The finding of this study shows that students from low ACS household are the poorest performing students, even if they're attending private schools. So this finding imply that education system in South Asia fails to equip students from marginal backgrounds and benefits the advantaged group. These are the references I used. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Rakibul. Conscious of time, I want to proceed with the next presentation, but also want to remind you that you may post your questions using the Q&A button of MS Teams. And please include your questions there, and we will give the floor to the presenters towards the end and give them a chance to respond to your questions. So the next presentation, the third presentation, is titled Guiding Education Programming for the Most Disadvantaged Children and Adolescents in South Asia. And it will be presented by Matt Brossard and Matthew Townshend. And Matt is working for UNICEF, Regional Office of South Asia in Nepal. And Matthew is also a consultant to the same office, but based in South Africa. Matthew, the floor is yours. Please share your screen. Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much, Turgay, and it was great to see the previous presentation. So my name is Matt, and you have another Matthew with us. I am indeed the Regional Education Advisor in Kathmandu Regional Office, covering the 8 countries of South Asia. We are seeing their education program, and I'm lucky to be accompanied by Matthew Townshend, who is a fantastic education economist who has done most of the things you would see in this presentation. We are staying in South Asia after the great presentation of the colleague on the private schools and difference with non-private school in South Asia. I just want to say as an introduction that before giving the floor to Matthew, that I'm very happy and delighted that New York DAPM and the University of Bristol have organized this conference. I think it's a great opportunity to use the wealth of those great mixed data, including on foundational learning, to make them speak and to give some actually programming guidance for our programs at UNICEF, but even more broadly. The situation in South Asia is with 6 out of 10 children not able to read by the age of 10, which means foundational learning is big, not yet these slides. And we have like 93 million of out-of-school children and adolescents that are mainly secondary school age adolescents, 75 million. So the thing we wanted to do with Matthew is to look at all the mixed grade data to look at a couple of things. One, what is the situation in terms of schooling status of the different children and adolescents in the region? Because of course the programmatic response would be different according to them having never attended any school or having actually completed, for example, primary. And you will see a surprising result, in particular in reference to what was presented just before. And the second thing was around foundational learning. So how we look also similarly to what the previous presenter presented, what are the factors that are affecting foundational learning, and using both descriptive statistic and regression in order to, again, have some parameters or some factors to put on the table for the conversation between UNICEF and government of those countries. I already spent 3 minutes for this introduction, so I will now hand over to Matthew, who will present the main findings of our analysis before taking back the floor for the policy recommendation. Over to you, Matthew.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you to everybody who's attended today's presentation. So in just looking at the snapshot of the mixed data that we have available to us, as Matt mentioned, it is incredibly rich, which from an analysis perspective allows a lot of opportunity in terms of what we can do. I just want to point out 3 main things. And the first is that what we have is we have a good time series available to us. So we've got the first mixed study in Bangladesh from 2006, ranging through to studies which have been done as recently as sort of a year or 2 ago. And we have that good time series. We also have very recent data available to us. So using the mix, we're able to understand what the situation is, roughly speaking, today. And then the third point that we get from the mixed data is that within that mix 6, there's a very deep level of data which has been added, especially in terms of that foundational learning module. So we're able to use the mixed data to do a huge amount of analysis. And what I want to do today is to not get into too much detail in terms of the analysis that was done, but to move through the slides at a reasonable pace to give everybody an idea of the type of analysis that we could do, some of the descriptive statistics that do come out, some of the regression analysis that we were able to do, and specifically from a programmatic perspective, just to give you a flavor of some of the usefulness that we were able to draw from the results. So looking at never attended school, as I mentioned, what we're able to do is if we take a cross-section of the most recent data that we have for the 4 countries that have mixed within the South Asia region, and then looking at the individual provinces within Pakistan, we're able to get a good idea as to what is the profile from the descriptive statistics of who hasn't attended school. And we're able to pull out a lot of very useful common vulnerability factors to determine at a high level and roughly speaking what that picture is for school attendance across different groups of children. And what you can see here is we've pulled out a graph looking at gender, location, rural versus urban, rural being the major vulnerable group, looking at the analysis, and then also at the poorest quintile. So you can understand then, roughly speaking, what the picture is in terms of that sort of cross-section of school attendance and in which regions there are specific challenges. Also looking at the time series results, we're able to get a lot of very useful information. So if we, broadly speaking, look at SDG 4 and the goal that countries are trying to achieve universal access to basic education, the time series data that we're able to get gives us very useful understanding as to the rate of change happening at countries in terms of access to school. Firstly, in terms of the direction, is it moving the right way? Are more children accessing school? Obviously, if it's going the other way, that's a warning bell for analysis and further attention. But in terms of countries are making progress, are they making quick enough progress to likely reach universal access by 2030 in line with the SDG 4 goals? So the cross-section analysis allows us to look at that. So as an example, Bangladesh, moving from 9% of children never attending school to 6%, 9% in 2006, 6% in 2012, and then down to 3% in 2019. That is a very positive trend and gives us a good indication that that is moving in the right direction at a good speed. There are other countries, however, which are moving much slower. So if you look at Khyber Pakhtunkhwa as an example, moving from 21% of children never accessing school, it's actually moved up to 22%. So firstly, we can see it's in the wrong direction, and also the magnitude that's still left between now and 2030 from a programmatic perspective is obviously important to be aware of. What we also want to look at is we want to look at the retainment of students within schools. So we're not just interested in access. We want to look at the proportion of students who are able to get into school and then who are also able to stay in school. So the mixed data allows us to analyze that. So we were able to look at which students were able to progress past primary school. And what we can see is that you can see a huge deviation in terms of the profile, again, at a descriptive statistic level of which of the students are dropping out and the number of them that are falling out of the education system. So it's helping us to focus in terms of early enrollment, getting students actually into the education system on time, and then trying to keep them in schools. And who are we trying to put the attention on in terms of retaining them within the education systems? Again, the time series data allows us to determine that profile and how it has been changing over time. Then I just want to move to some regression analysis, which we also had done on the mixed data to try and understand, again, not just from a descriptive statistics perspective, but from a more statistically significant point of view, those vulnerability factors that we've been looking at. To what degree are they affecting schooling outcomes? And what we did is we looked at years of schooling, and we regressed that on the major vulnerability factors which I pointed out earlier, which is gender, to understand whether girls have a worse outcome in terms of years of schooling, location, to determine the extent to which living in a rural area also affects the years of schooling that children are able to achieve, and then also at the wealth quintiles to determine to what extent being poor also has a significant effect on education in terms of years of schooling. What we're able to get from this information is obviously now, because we're doing move beyond sort of that descriptive statistics, we're able to understand, looking at a variety of variables in at the same time, we're able to determine where the biggest stress factors are and where sort of programming focus could make the biggest difference. And also, obviously, within the wealth quintiles, not just looking at poorest and richest, but also looking at the distinction between the poorest and the second quintile, and the possibility of small shifts in terms of financial support to those poorest students, to what extent that could realize a meaningful change in terms of years of schooling. Moving over to the foundational learning outcomes, we were able to, again, at the descriptive level, look at the outcomes from a literacy and a numeracy perspective, the learning that children were achieving. So not just being in school. From SDG 4's perspective, we want to know, firstly, are children in school, but are they learning? And that's the critical sort of component to it, that they actually are moving through the system and learning at the same time. So we're able to determine at each of the different age groups the degree of learning which is happening and how those profiles are evolving over age. Again, putting programmatic focus on certain areas within the system in terms of where impact can be made in terms of trying to improve outcomes. And then again, just give you an indication again that we look at foundational learning across those vulnerability categories. And a regression analysis again, I'm going to move through this one quite quickly because I've got a results slide that I want to spend a minute or two on. But looking at the regression analysis, looking at learning outcomes in terms of foundational skills and the degree to which, again, specific vulnerability factors had an impact in terms of the odds of children acquiring foundational literacy and numeracy skills. We'll talk a bit about the results of those two regression analyses now. But some of the main findings that we're able to pull out from the analysis, which from a programmatic perspective have a lot of value, is that what we're seeing is very low access rates. We're seeing that many children are still not able to enroll in their education systems. In Afghanistan, as an example, it's between 41 and 66%, depending on the vulnerability category. It's much worse in Balochistan, up to 79%. And then you're able to see in sort of the better performing countries and provinces like Gilgit-Baltistan, as an example, you've still got at the good end sort of 14% of students are able to access schools, but all the way up to 33% in the sort of more vulnerable groups. So there are access problems throughout the system in the region. What we're also seeing is stagnant access rates. So where we are seeing movements in access rates, we're seeing them changing quite slowly. So as an example, in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we're actually seeing a worsening of the access rates. So we're seeing fewer students being able to access the education systems. And in countries where there have been improvements, like Afghanistan and Sindh in Pakistan, we've seen small improvements, 2% and 7% in terms of improvements in the access rates over 12 and 6 years, respectively. So in terms of trying to get to universal access by 2030, you can see that those slow progression rates are problematic and they need to be hastened. So it is moving in the right direction, but not quickly enough. We're seeing high attrition rates. So we're seeing very high proportions of students who are dropping out of school before primary school. And that's high across countries and across the provinces in Pakistan, which is obviously problematic and needs to be a programmatic focus. And then the last 2 points, and this is from the regression analysis, is we're seeing a prevalence of vulnerabilities. So we're seeing a lot of common vulnerability factors have a significant negative impact on school attendance. So even after students are able to gain access to schools, the years of school are falling by between 0.4 and 0.6 years for children in rural areas. So you can see rural location being a problem and needing to be a programmatic focus. What you can see for gender is that in Sindh, as an example, 0.5 years of schooling are lost on average if you're a girl. And 1.3 years in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So you can see that gender is a vulnerability, and also the last one here is that wealth has a massive impact in terms of years of schooling, between 1.5 and 4.5 years of schooling for the children in the richest quintile are getting that much more from the education systems. And then just the last point to note, and this is in terms of skills development, that most children do not have foundational skills, and that the odds fall dramatically depending on the vulnerability group that you're in. So your odds for having foundational skills are 0.6 to 0.8 for girls, 0.6 to 0.9 for children in rural areas, 0.6 to 0.7 for children with disabilities, and also very important from a programmatic perspective, and this seems to be the biggest impact variable, is between 0.3 to 0.5 for children from minority groups. So handing back over to Matt for how we can now use some of these findings from a programmatic perspective.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for this and for the great work you have done to lead to that. Just our last slide is about, indeed, policy programming recommendation. I'm sure if we ask everybody in the room now, we will all have done probably primary education, probably even secondary education. It is not the reality of millions of children and adolescents in this region. So one of the first recommendations is to target them. It's not easy because it's not our mindset, because we are not in this situation, but really targeting better with government program, with UNICEF program, the poorest, the children with disabilities, those from ethnic minorities, those discriminated by political or social norms, of course, talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others. Second, which is linked, how we can strengthen our cross-sectoral work for, in particular, the out-of-school adolescents. I mean, that are the bulk of the out-of-school children. It's adolescents, so working with our colleagues from social policy, our colleagues from other sectors to, for example, do cash transfer, because as we saw in our presentation, in the previous presentation, poverty, low income is one of the main drivers of not going to school. Also, putting on the table school as an integrated service platform. So having school as for nutrition, learning, etc., a place where kids can get the minimum, the basics that they need to thrive in life. And now talking more about the foundational learning piece, which is, as I was saying before, 6 out of 10 children not able to read by the age of 10. South Asia accounts for 31% of the global problems. If we want to reach the SDG 4 that was presented in the first presentation, we need to have South Asia delivering on it. And we account for 31% of the problem, 21% in India, 10% in the other countries. What does it take? It takes to implement at scale what the evidence is saying as working, meaning good early childhood education, both at home and preschool, support to teacher for doing targeted instruction and structured pedagogy, teaching the kids in their mother tongue. We teach the kids not in their mother tongue, it doesn't help, and digital learning solutions that are helpful for including the poorest, not increasing the digital divide, but narrowing it. And last but not least, keeping on doing good research, good evidence, strengthening it in order to know more about what are the implementation modalities that are helping really for learning. So there is a lot of research done at global level. We need to do it country-based now. Using more behavioral science. We don't use behavioral science as much as health sector is using. And we are, in spite of that, a sector that depends so much on the behaviors of actors, teachers there. And last but not least, the use of learning assessment at all levels, from the classroom to the system level, not forgetting the mid-level manager. And linking back to mix, I'm a big fan of mix. I was one of the person where to have the foundational learning module being a reality now, but now there is this nice thing called mixed link that is applied in a few countries, pilot countries now, how we can link household survey with HEMIS, Education Management Information System data, with mixed links, so we can have this data speaking more, not only about the household factors, the children factor, but also the policies, the condition in the school that are really leading to better learning. Sorry, we're a bit long. We took 18 minutes, 3 minutes away, but again,
Yeah.
thank you so much for inviting.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matthew. Appreciate that. And we now move to the last presentation, fourth presentation, but again, reminding you to type your questions in the Q&A part so that we can direct questions to the presenters, not only for Matt and Matthew, but for all the three presentations we have heard so far, you may ask questions about. So the fourth presentation is titled Breaking the Darkness, How Multidimensional Energy Poverty Affects Child Learning in Developing Countries, and it will be presented by John Mefful from University of Cape Coast, Ghana, with three of his colleagues from the same university. John, please, you have the floor. We can't hear you. John, are you there?
Yes, sure. Please, I'm here. Sorry,
Okay.
my mic was on mute. Sorry.
Okay, now we can hear you well. Yeah, please share your presentation. Right,
Okay,
we can
please, can you
see.
see my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. So presenting on breaking the darkness, how multidimensional energy poverty affects child learning outcomes in developing countries. And I'm doing this with my co-authors, Elizabeth, Dr. Jacob, and then Robert. We are all from University of Cape Coast School of Economics. So the topic of energy poverty is something that is not new in the system, and it's actually because of its detrimental effects on household welfare. Majority of the studies or the arguments have been centered around how it affects climate and then its effects on the household as well. So because of this, it's actually a core concern for policymakers, and because of that, they have created a space among the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically with the Goal 7, which seeks to ensure that there's a universal access to affordable, reliable, and then clean modern energy latest by 2030. So because of this, we've advocated for a lot of investment to be made in the dimension of energy. And in 2019, for example, we see in African countries, $7.9 billion, was spent in energy infrastructure. Coming to 2020, it's reduced a little by $6.5 billion also in the energy infrastructure. Perhaps this could be due to the impacts of the COVID-19, which made microeconomic issues not stabilize. Yeah. However, still coming into the STAB region in the West Africa, for example, we see that 37% of their budgets, on infrastructure is usually on energy issues. And then we'll see similar trend also for the Central African countries, who also spend about 11% of their infrastructure budget on energy. Despite all these investments, there is still the issue of energy poverty, which has been recorded in the Sub-Saharan African region, according to World Bank's report in 2024. There are about 657 million people who are energy poor. The study of both Nina and then GAPSI in 2023 also projected that with the investment that have been made and infrastructure that have been built, it's going to yield a marginal decrease in this number by only 7 million people. And looking at the report also of the multidimensional poverty network, the peer network in 2017, it was evident that the countries that are more prone to energy poverty were West African countries and then Central African countries, with West African accounting for about 65.3%, and that of Central African countries who are accounting for about 10.8%. At the same time, and learning poverty or poor academic performance has also been observed in developing countries, with them, the developing countries, accounting for about 80% of children between the ages of 10 and 12 who are unable to read and then write. And the number increases to about 87% in the other sub-Saharan African countries. And this is worrying because they have a lot of policies and interventions that these countries have implemented to curb the issue of learning poverty. One has to do with ensuring that there is free access to education, especially at the basic level, and now they've increased it to the secondary level. Now, with the rising learning poverty issue, it is also transcending into school dropouts, so that we see at the primary level, 39% of children drop out of school, and out of these, 55% of them are male children. We move to that of the secondary level too. We also see that the dropout rate increased to 53%. And this is actually coming from the Ghana Education Fact Sheet, which was based on data from MS in 2020. And from there to realize that the number of children who drop out, majority of them were male children, which is about 22%. Getting into the locational dimensions to realize that the rural areas is having the higher records of children who drop out of school. So this raises core question for policy makers. Now, it has attracted a lot of interest in researching this area, and looking at Sen and then his team, they also attributed this issue. They looked at the energy poverty issue because we're trying to look at whether there's a link between energy poverty and then perhaps maybe some other core issues. And they are saying that energy poverty affects the living standards of children. However, their focus was more on the health of the children. We also see Elizabeth and also Nsenkyire and then the team also finding a positive correlation between energy poverty and then functional disability. In Ghana as well, we find Frimpong and also his team also saying that using cooking gas will marginally improve the learning outcome of children in rural Ghana, which is also more like one country specific issue, but it's also limited or restricted to just the rural areas. Further, Lane and then Autry in 2020, together with Kumsin in 2024, also established that there is a relationship between energy poverty and then the odds of mild and severe depression. Okay, so looking at all these, the question that we are asking ourselves now is, indeed, what is the link between, or what is the impact of multidimensional energy poverty on the learning outcomes of children, given what has already been done in the system, and realize that most of these studies either focus on the health or perhaps some depression issues, or better, so they're just country-specific issues in there. So then there's the need for us to enter into the data, the literature, and then get a better understanding of how this multidimensional energy poverty can affect the learning outcomes of children. So based on that, we are guided by these three core questions, which the first one is there a link? Is there a link between multidimensional energy poverty and learning outcomes of children? And if there is a link, then what category of children? Is it the categorization, is it by gender, the age, location, or country block, that the link between energy poverty and learning outcome is more severe or affects the most? And then further, it is also important for us to know the channels through which this multidimensional energy poverty affects the learning outcomes of children. In answering these questions, we make contribution to literature, okay, in the dimension of first, the discussion that is already ongoing on energy poverty and child education. And then further, we also add onto the discussion about the functional disability, depression, anxiety pathways through which energy poverty can affect learning outcomes of children. And then again, we highlight the differential effects of energy poverty on the learning outcomes of children based on the different categories that we have already mentioned. So looking at this, we conceptualize our study by saying that multidimensional energy poverty affects the learning outcomes of children. One, through time use, which is fetching firewood, which has mostly been at the discussion in the lots of literatures. And then again, it also passes through the health of children. It has also been discussed in the literature already, and that one they only focus on the the BMI for age. And then now what is missing in this link is that of the anxiety, depression, and then also functional disability, because studies have already established that multidimensional energy poverty or energy poverty itself leads to anxiety, depression, and also can cause functional disability. So we extend that argument onto looking at how it affects the learning outcomes of children. So based on that, we use data from the multiple indicators cluster survey data, the round 6 specifically. And then we, as I mentioned earlier, we focused on West African and Central African countries because according to the reports out there, we find that these two countries are experiencing hyper multidimensional energy poverty issues in there. So we focus on these countries. However, based on data availability, after merging and then dropping missing observations, we ended up with 12,885 children who are between the ages of 5 and 17 inclusive. And in estimating our multidimensional energy poverty, we looked at these indicators, which the first is access to electricity, clean fuel, refrigeration, energy, education and entertainment, communication, and then space cooling. And looking at these, they all have the weight that they may contribute to the energy poverty issue may vary. So we place much premium on that of electricity access and then that of our clean fuel access by giving them higher weight relative to the others. So for the countries, like I mentioned, West African and then Central African countries, and we ended up with 11 countries out of the 28 countries in there. And our dependent variables, we focus on reading comprehension and then calculations, which specifically deals with the functional abilities. Having these skills would help them develop analytical skills as well. And in the data, I realized that most of all these were being captured with about 5 questions in there. So we developed an additive index for each of these 5 questions, and then we damage them to show whether the child has some level of functional learning abilities in there. And our independent variables, we consider the age, education of the child, the number of children in the same age category, the sex, and then whether the child gets help with homework, whether there's some more treatment in the household, like hitting the child, whether someone reads to the child, the household allocation, the sex of the household head, age of the household head, the wealth, and then we also looked at the country fixed effects as well. So with our econometrics techniques, the first model, we use the multidimensional energy poverty index approach in here, and the first model is expressing the weight as well as the indicators for each of the multidimensional energy variables. And this was actually, we followed the works of Kumsin and then his team to come up with this. Then we moved to the step further with our baseline model, which we are saying that the learning outcome of a child is a function of multidimensional energy poverty, the child's own characteristics, household characteristics, some country fixed effects, and some idiosyncratic errors in there. And we also anticipate that the link between learning outcomes and the multidimensional energy poverty may be endogenous. So we moved a step further by correcting this, and we're actually arguing that price volatility can be a core issue that would affect the multidimensional energy poverty. It also has the potential affecting the learning outcome. However, the data does not give us the ability to measure this price volatility in there. Although we could have considered using distance to an energy source, or maybe the price of energy itself, the data also didn't give us that leverage in this. We are not able to use that as an instrument to ensure our estimates are identified. We could have also considered
John,
the
please
cluster.
speed up a little bit. You are running out of time. Please speed up a little bit.
Sure. So first, with our descriptives in here, we looked at households who are multidimensional energy poor, and we look at the percentage of them who have learning poverty. So with that of mass proficiency, we find that Dr. Congo, the issue in the DR Congo is much stronger relative to the other countries. In the context of comprehension too, yes, so Dr. Congo is still leading. However, it's being followed by Chad. And then in the context of reading as well, now we see a little change in the dynamics with Nigeria leading, and then still followed by DR Congo, and then Chad, and then the rest. Now we looked at the country block dimensional. So we looked at English-speaking countries and that of French-speaking countries. And it was quite interesting to find that French-speaking countries have a lot of learning poverty, and this is the dimension of mathematics. We get into that of comprehension as well. French-speaking countries are leading, and that of reading as well. French-speaking countries are leading. So now we zoom into our regression. With our baseline model, it is giving us an indication that our first question, yes, indeed, is answered, because there's a link, a statistical significant link between energy poverty and learning outcomes. And over here, we find that it reduces the learning outcome, that is the ability of a child to know how to do calculation, do comprehension, and then also reading as well. Now, looking at our endogenously corrected model, which we use the Lobel approach, we find that the impacts increase a little with the exception of reading, which is also given as an indication that our baseline model, the estimates were biased than was because of the endogeneity issue. So now we move also to check the robustness of our observation by first dummying the multidimensional energy poverty variable, and we use a cutoff of 0.5 initially, and we find that the results were consistent with our baseline and then our endogenously corrected model. Then we also move to the traditional approach of doing the cutoff point, which is 0.33, and then we still find that the results are robust. So now we are more justified to zoom into further analysis. Then we went through with heterogeneity by sex of the child, and we find that the impact is higher for female children, and this could be attributed to the gender, the social norms attached to the male and the female child issues in there. So female child are more likely to do a lot of kitchen stuff with the cooking and that, and we find that the impact affects them more than that of the male children. And then amongst children between the ages of 5 and 9, and then 10 and 14, we also find that the impact is higher for children between the ages of 10 and 14. And this could also be because, they are more likely to support their parents in the kitchen because of their level of maturity. Then with the urban and then rural dimension too, with the exception of calculation, which the rural dimension was not significant, we find that the issue of learning poverty is more prevalent in the rural locations, and the contribution of multidimensional poverty is higher than that of the urban location as well. Then now we get into the English-speaking and the French-speaking countries, and then again we find that the impact is more higher for the French-speaking countries than that of the English-speaking countries as well. Then we disaggregated the multidimensional energy poverty variable to see the indicators, which one is contributing the most. And in this, we can find that the consistent one throughout rests on the communication and that of cooling space, although the other indicators contributed to some of the learning outcomes in there. And this is giving us an indication that the cooling space and the communication may be core variables. And these also have been established to have effects on depression, anxiety issues, as well as that of the functional disability issues. So now we zoom into the exploring the channels in there. And yes, indeed, we found first that depression is a significant determinant of learning poverty. And then we looked at that of disability as well, and it's also significant. We looked at anxiety, and it was not significant for the calculation and then comprehension, but then reading, it was significant. But looking at the channel in there, we find the statistical significant evidence to say that multidimensional energy poverty passes through anxiety, depression, and that of disability to affect the learning outcomes of children. So with our key findings, we actually say that energy poverty has a negative impact on learning outcome of children in both West Africa and then Central Africa. And again, the impact is more stronger for rural, female, older children and children in French-speaking countries relative to their counterparts. And for the channels, we conclude that anxiety, depression, and functional disability are the channels through which multidimensional energy poverty affects learning outcomes. So we conclude that energy poverty is indeed a significant determinant, or has a significant detrimental effect on the human capital of children in both West Africa, or better so in developing countries. With the limitations, like I mentioned earlier, we didn't get the opportunity to measure another aspect of the multidimensional energy poverty because there was lack of data for us to measure the affordability dimension. And also we only used 11 countries because of data availability. So we commend to policymakers to step up policies. In fact, we need to advocate more for more investment to be made in the energy infrastructure development to ensure that there is easy, accessible, and affordable clean energy to all, especially those in the rural areas where we say that we need to intensify the targeted initiative like what some countries have done already. We need to still do that with the rural electrification and also subsidizing these energy items for them to be less expensive so that the rural dwellers can adopt this. And I would also want to add that the French-speaking countries also should be given special attention with regards to energy infrastructure. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, John. We have more than 10 minutes left. I hope we will have enough time to respond to the questions we received so far. We may have a couple of additional minutes that we can add to the end. So I'm passing the microphone to Ivana to go over the questions and direct the... Okay, Ivana, please.
Thank you, Turgay, and many thanks to all the presenters for their very insightful contributions. We do have a couple of questions, and I will read them one by one. The questions that pertain to all presentations that were delivered during this session. I would like to kindly ask presenters to answer the questions in a very brief manner in the order that they're going to be asked. So we have a question related to the first presentation, question for Pearl Kyei. And the question is coming from me. Is there a particular reason why the indicator on ever attended school was selected for the analysis versus, for example, the current school attendance? Following the question for Mr. Hassan, Rakibul, you have mentioned in your presentation that there is a data cleaning element to take place. If you can very briefly describe what exactly that entails. We have also a question from Deepak Kumar when you have presented the number of cases in your presentations, were they related to the weighted or unweighted numbers? And if you can please answer also the question from Mr. Halmeiz Iftikhar. I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. What was the conceptual framework for selecting these variables, and did the model fit? For the presentation from Matt and Matthew, also a question from Deepak Kumar. How do duty bearers target the most disadvantaged households? Is there a way to identify the households that are considered the most vulnerable? And also a question from Mr. Hassan Rakibul, one of the presenters. For Matt and Matthew, how do you see the sustainability of the CCTs or the conditional cash transfers? So over with the questions, and please, presenter, if you can answer them in the order that I have posed them. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think with respect to why I use ever attending instead of currently attending, because I was really interested in deprivation of education as an outcome. And current attendance...
Pearl, I'm afraid that we don't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I see that you're unmuted.
We can
you
hear
me now?
Yes, we can.
We can hear.
Okay.
Ivana, we can.
You can
Should
hear?
I go ahead?
Oh, sorry. That must be something on my end. Sorry, Pearl, please go ahead.
Okay, I was saying that because I was interested in really deprivation of education, because for children who are currently attending school, some of them who are not attending may have attended in the past. And so in this initial paper, as I said, it's really a series. One of the things I will be looking at later is current attendance and the level attended. But I just wanted to start by looking at absolute deprivation of education. Thank you.
Thank you. Hassan, over to you.
Thank you so much for your question. So regarding the question of data cleaning, so I cleaned the data where like some of the data actually were missing for some key variables. For example, for some dependent variables, we have the observations for the children who are aged from 7 to 14. So this was administered to only the children who are aged 7 to 14. So I had to restrict them. And also I had like further restriction for the students who are actually in primary education level in those 4 countries. So for doing that, I had to restrict those 2. And for other variables, I had to, how should I say, clean the data, like the missing data, but I didn't restrict them. And for the question from Dr. Deepak Kumar Dey, yes, the numbers are actually unweighted for this case. And for another question, I forgot her name, sorry, regarding the covariates I used. So I actually followed some previous literature, and also I wanted to implement whether do I have the variables in the mixed data set. So for some of the variables I actually wanted to use, but the data set actually limited me to use some of them. So I had to use only the variables I have in the data sets. So for that, I could not fully follow any of the studies because none of the studies actually looked into this kind of situations. And also, why did I conduct research on South Asia, and why did I like compare between those countries? Because you may know that the primary private schools are actually mushroomed in South Asia. So there are so many private schools, and it is getting more popular day by day in this region. So we want to see like some of them are like showing like African region, and some of them are showing like developing countries as a whole. So that's why I wanted to show South Asia as a context, and also how should I say, presented the country as a separate samples and observations. Thank you so much. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Hassan. My apologies, Matt and Matthew, just before going to your answers, I would like to add very quickly one more question from Cynthia. Question is for John. If John, you can also explain a little bit more the differences that you mentioned in math proficiency between French and English speaking countries. Thank you. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Ivana. Very good question. On the cash transfer one, maybe Matthew, can you start with what the data is saying based on our analysis, and I will complement.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the question, Hassan. Yeah, I mean, a very interesting question, and specifically around the point of sustainability. What we wanted to do with the analysis is not only focus on sort of the fact that poverty is an issue, because there's only so much you can do from a policy perspective and a resource perspective around trying to address poverty. Interestingly, when you look at the difference between the bottom quintile and the second quintile, so just one wealth group up, there are very big differences in terms of learning outcomes, both in terms of years of schooling that they're able to achieve and in terms of learning outcomes. So we're talking about trying to understand then the marginal sort of difference that you need to make to these household income levels through those transfers to try and at least get their education household expenditures, those out-of-pocket household expenditures and education, to a level in line with that second quintile. And if you were able to do that, firstly identifying obviously the amount that they spend, and then targeting it in such a way, those grants, those transfers in such a way that it obviously goes through to the correct sort of end outcome, the impact that you could have is very, very large. So I wanted to just point that out from a sustainability perspective, that we're not talking about turning poor people rich. We're talking about making people in that very, very lowest income quintile look slightly more representative of just one income quintile above. So over to Matt.
And just to build on that and giving you a couple of additional findings. So there is one thing that done by Nsenkyire, the UNICEF Research Center, that shows that actually unconditional transfer could be as efficient as conditional transfer, because the person was asking about conditional cash transfer. Second thing, which is something we have looked at recently, including within UNICEF in South Asia, looking at a very, very effective program that are what we call cash plus transfer. So when you give the cash is good, but when you give the cash and you give also plus, meaning some advocacy or some community engagement work about going to school or going to a health center, actually the effect is much bigger. So that the two key things we have from the evidence that is very, very interesting from a programmatic sustainable perspective is, one, it's not necessarily the condition that is making a difference. Second, though, when you work cross-sectorally, meaning giving cash, but also access or advocacy for a service, education or health or nutrition, we are making a bigger difference. Now, if you allow me, Ivana, as I have the floor, maybe I can answer the second question that was for us, which was around... Yes.
Yeah, how are the most vulnerable households targeted?
I answered this one also in the chat. Actually, that's a very good question too. And on this one, I put some references. It's not easy. We know we can use mix, but mix is just based on sample, correct? So if we want to have a comprehensive picture of who to target, not only those that were sampled and responding to a mix, for which we know they are in the poorest quintile. So like pragmatic, effective ideas that have been put on the table and started to be implemented is using electricity bills. So because the idea is that an household who doesn't pay any electricity bill, for example, is probably poorer than an household that have free TVs and I don't know how many electric devices, and so paying an electric bill that is bigger. That's the approach that is used in Sri Lanka, based on this former World Bank chief economist, close to be Nobel Prize person, Chantal Nevarayan, and that's what I would recommend. Over.
Thank you very much, Matt. And 1 minute for the last question. John, over to you. If you can very quickly just say a little bit more on the differences between French and English-speaking countries that you found in your analysis.
Yeah, sure. I think that's an interesting question, because it was something that it seemed on our mind. However, in our analysis, it turned out that the French-speaking countries were more multidimensionally energy poor, and this could perhaps explain why the impact is higher in those countries. However, getting into the depths to get the nitty-gritties in there is something that we are yet to do. So I'm sure in the final work, we'll be able to explain it's further in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you hopefully on the next sessions as well. Thanks for all the presenters and attendees.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a good day. Have a good evening. See you in the next sessions.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.